Alright. Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to the third video for chapter 4. In this video we're going to take a look at the respiratory system and the excretory system. So let's jump into it, okay? The excretory system. The process of excretion is the removal of unwanted excess or toxic products from the body. Basically, anything that the body doesn't want or need is the process of excretion. Now, it varies. If you are a single cell organism, a unicellular organism, then usually excretion will happen through the plasma membrane. It will just be through exocytosis and it will just go straight out. In multicellular organisms, however, you need a special organ for the process of excretion. Okay, there are two major waste products in the body. Well, actually, there's probably more than two, but these are the main ones on a cellular level that each one of your cell needs to remove. Okay, the first is what we call nitrogen waste or nitrogenous waste. These wastes are any leftover protein from amino acids, and they're removed by your excretory system. And the second one is carbon dioxide, which is removed by the respiratory system. Okay, now, when we say these waste, we don't include digestive waste, in other words, the stuff that you eat that comes out from the other side. We're referring to specifically things that your cells have produced and need to get rid of because there's too much of, or an excess of unwanted. Okay, so the excretory system filters your blood from the body and it removes the nitrogenous wastes such as urea and other toxic compounds. Okay, here's a diagram of what it looks like. The components, you've got the main organ for the kidney, and then you've also got the connection between the kidney to the bladder, the ureter, and then the bladder which stores the urine, and then the urethra which transports out of the body, which obviously varies between females and males. Okay, now let's take a look at nitrogenous waste. What are they and what do they do? So for mammals, nitrogenous waste come from proteins. When you and I eat meat, we break down the meat into protein, and we break that protein back down into amino acids, and we use that amino acids to build our own cells. However, excess amino acids are not stored in the body. They're not stored, rather they need to be removed from the cell and then therefore removed from the body. And so that's why they're called nitrogenous waste, because they have a nitrogen base in them. Okay, and that's the main part of the protein. Yeah, so during digestion, the protein's broken down, excess is stored, and instead of throwing it away, they are dissected in the liver, and then a certain section is removed and the other parts are being recycled. Okay, so the main part that's being removed is what we call ammonia, or NH3, and the carbon skeleton is kept, right? And then the ammonia is converted to the urea, and then we dump the urea. Oops, let me go back one step. There you go. Okay, so here's what the amino acid would look like. Yeah, this is the structure for the amino acid, and you've got a carbon in the middle and a hydrogen sticking off the end. Here is what we call the side chain, or the R chain, and then you've got a carboxyl group which sits over here, and then you've got the amine group over here. Yeah, the NH3 here and the H here gets dumped, right? And then what you're left with is this carbon skeleton, which is kept and used by the cell, and then the NH3 ammonia mixes with carbon dioxide to form urea and water, and the urea is the stuff that's in your piss. Okay, so that's where the urine comes from. Okay, it's a water soluble component, and it's useful because it's water soluble, means it's non-toxic once it dissolves in the water and becomes diluted. Okay, now ammonia can be converted into urea, but it can also be converted to a few other things before it's excreted. Okay, on its own, ammonia is actually highly toxic to the body, and so the reason why we convert it into urea is because once it gets converted into urea, it becomes less toxic and is more readily, easily removed from the body. However, that takes a bit of energy to do. Okay, so ammonia is produced in the liver cells. Sorry. Requires the least amount of energy to remove because you can just dump it, but it's highly toxic, right? So it's soluble in water, but it's the most toxic version. So in fish, when fish live in an aquatic environment, what they can do is they can dump the ammonia straight into the water, and then it dissolves in the water straight away. However, it's a very toxic component, and large amounts of it can become really bad for cells to accumulate. Right? On the other hand, urea, once it gets converted, is much less toxic than ammonia, However, it requires energy to make it non-toxic. Yeah, so that means you can keep it in your blood, for example, for for a longer amount of time without it becoming too toxic. Okay, and then your body then gets rid of it whenever it needs to. So the excretion rate is a bit slower. Okay, uric acid, which is the kind of third component, is completely non-toxic. Also produced in the living cells, but this requires the most amount of energy to convert it into a non-toxic form, which also means you can store it for longer than necessary without having to be removed. Okay, mammals convert nitrogenous waste into urea, fish into ammonia, and birds will convert it into uric acid. Yeah, you can sort of see its usefulness in that they can store it in their body for longer periods of time, and also when they don't need to consume as much water to get rid of it, it's useful there as well. Okay. Now let's look at the human excretory system. So all metabolic wastes are transported to the kidneys for excretion. Here is what a kidney looks like in diagram, like a real sample. And then here is also the kind of the blood network that fits around the kidneys. Okay. The kidneys filter all the blood in the body. Yeah. At rest, they receive about 1 liter per minute, which is 25% of the heart output. Yeah. It contains a rich blood supply, and you can sort of see it sort of showing up there in this kind of network of capillaries around your kidney. Okay. Now this main artery is the aorta, yeah, and it comes straight from the heart. So what that you can sort of see there, when the heart pumps blood out and it goes down into the aorta, a good section of it goes out from the aorta and into the kidneys where it's filtered, and then it comes back and returns straight back to the heart. Okay, now if I was to go backwards a few steps, I can show you that in the diagram forms there. Yeah, so a certain section of it goes out into the kidneys, and then once it filters out all of the urea, it goes back out into the vein, or the vena cava, which is the biggest vein in your body, and that goes straight back to your heart. Now, where that is relevant is that that 25% means at all times about a quarter of your blood is being filtered, yeah, and then put back into your heart, where it's sent back around the body again. Okay, which is why the kidneys perform a really important function, because they're cleaning the blood all the time. Okay. Now, they kind of look like beans, and they kind of are about the size of, about 11 centimeters by 6 by 2.5, and about 150 grams each. Now, you can only survive for a few days without your kidneys, because they are so important in stopping your blood from becoming too toxic with all the wastes that your cells are producing, or the blood's collecting from your wastes. Okay, it removes the waste from the blood. It also removes excess hormones that you produce, hormones that are no longer needed. And it also maintains the water and ion balance for diffusion purposes, back in chapter 1. Okay, and it maintains blood pH levels. Okay, now the process. Each kidney is comprised of many units called nephron. Yeah, a nephron is one filtering structure of the kidney, and the kidney has stacks of it, all piled together, all doing the same thing. Okay, and each nephron has 3 primary functions. The first thing it will do is it will filter the blood, about 180 liters every 24 hours, but it will only dump about 1 to 2 liters of that, which is the stuff that you actually pee out. Okay. Other than filtration of the blood, it also is involved in the reabsorption of water, ions, and excess substances that need to be returned back into the bloodstream. So things that have actually kind of come out into the blood gets pushed and then reabsorbed by the nephron back into the blood to be used later on, especially in conditions where you need it more, like, for example, when you're dehydrated and need more water back into your blood. Okay. And finally, it's also used in the active transport, or the removal or secretion of other things that your body doesn't want, such as drugs and other ions, into the tubules. Okay. So here's a diagram. What it looks like, there's your kidney, and then if you zoom in on this particular component, the nephron is a single unit connected to a blood capillary network, and then it goes down, back up, and then it has this collecting duct that gets removed. Yeah. Now, the top part component sits in the renal cortex, and the bottom part here sits in what we call the medulla. Yeah. And when they're piled together, they form a renal pyramid. Okay, which then overall has several renal pyramids within one kidney. If I zoom in again, this is what it looks like there. Yeah, and I'll explain what each component sort of does later on in this video. But you can sort of see there your artery network going in, surrounding your things, and then all the veins that is recollecting the stuff and pushing it back into your bloodstream to be recycled. And then the excess goes into the collecting duct and then goes straight to the bladder. Okay. Now, what does the process look like? It's a very complicated process, but there are a few kind of key stages and steps that tends to happen. So step one, we start with a particular structure called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is a network of capillaries that sort of sits within another structure called the Bowman's capsule. Okay, this little network, the pressure here when the blood goes into this little small area, the pressure increases, and what it does is the pressure increases and it forces liquids out of the blood and into the Bowman's capsule. Okay, 20% of the blood plasma goes out of the blood here, and then proteins and blood cells are not filtered because they're too big, but otherwise everything else will get squeezed right out of the blood into the Bowman's capsule, and then it's straight into this particular component here called the proximal tubule. Okay, the Bowman's capsule collects the filtrate, which is what we call it now, filtrate, from the blood, and it goes into the proximal tubule. When it goes into here, right, you can sort of see it already starts to reabsorb any material that the body needs. Once again, mainly things like sodium, potassium, glucose, and amino acids. Excuse me, gets reabsorbed and then pushed back into the bloodstream. And then the rest will enter down into the next section, which is what we call the loop of Henle. Now, the loop of Henle was named after a particular guy named Henle, and it has two particular aspects to it. There's a descending arm which goes downwards, and then an ascending arm which goes back up. Now, in the descending arm, a lot of the water gets extracted from the tubule, and so it diffuses into, or it's a passive form diffusion into the rest of the kidney, and the water goes into the kidney, the medulla. And then what happens is, as it does that, it concentrates in the amount of salt that's there. Okay, and then what happens is, as the arm goes back up, as it ascends, it then extracts the rest of the salt ions, because the salt sort of leave and follow into where the water is, and then it gets collected into the distal tubule. Now, in the distal tubule, any excess drugs and other ions that is unwanted by the blood gets secreted into the distal tubule. Okay, and then finally, all of that goes into the collecting duct, which then sends that now called urine into the ureter, which then goes into the bladder. Okay. Now, there's a few things that can go wrong. There are a few diseases. So, chronic kidney disease, the symptoms include fatigue, nausea, vomiting, shortness of breath, high blood pressure, swollen ankles, face, and neck, and the production of abnormally small amounts of urine. Basically, your kidneys aren't functioning properly to produce the urine that you need, and so you've got this issue of a build-up within your body. Okay, the glomerulus filtration rate is lower than normal, so as low as 15 mils at the end of in end-stage kidney disease. And so what happens is people with chronic kidney disease will require hemodialysis. Now, hemodialysis is what this machine does. It replaces some of the functions of the kidney, and the blood is passed through a dialysis machine, which then filters it for the person because the kidneys are failing to do so. Okay. There's another one called kidney stones. Kidney stones are they're pretty terrible. What happens is when there's too much minerals or salts that sort of form in the kidney, they get stuck in the ureter, and then inside the bladder, and then it needs to be pushed out through the urethra. Now, for girls, that can be painful and quite bad, but for guys, that's also like a lot more painful because guys have a penis, and so the ureter has a longer distance to travel and is a lot more narrow comparatively. And so having kidney stones for guys is like a real nightmare. Especially if you have a big one. All right, let's take a look at the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system is responsible for respiration. Now, this form of respiration is different, or the word respiration here is not referring to cellular respiration, okay? However, it's useful to know that they are obviously connected. So aerobic respiration is the production of energy in the form of ATP. We went through this in chapter 3, where you have glucose and oxygen being converted into carbon dioxide and water, and that produces your ATP, which we then use for energy. Okay, because oxygen is required, it needs to be taken in, and carbon dioxide is a waste product and needs to be removed. Yeah. So once again, in unicellular organisms, this happens through the plasma membrane, but in multicellular organisms, it needs to be done through a specific organ, right? And so that whole process of taking in oxygen and removing carbon dioxide is called gas exchange. Okay. So gas exchange here, right, is done through the lungs of mammals or the gills of fish and other invertebrates. Okay. So the features, you need a bit of a large surface area to maximize the gas exchange, and then you also need a kind of a moist environment for the water to, the gas requires water for diffusion, and it needs to be thin, which means the membrane is short enough for the diffusion to occur between the external environment, in this case the air pockets inside of the lungs, and then the internal environment, which is your blood. Okay. You need to have a concentration gradient, yeah, which means that then there needs to be a net movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide to an area where there is less of it, and then there's a close network of capillaries for that exchange. Now, one of the key things you'll note, both between the lungs and the gills, is that they're both bright pink to a red color. Yeah, that is because they are filled with very large networks of capillaries, so fine that the whole thing kind of appears to be red. However, that capillaries is really important because it's so thin, it maximizes that surface area to absorb as much oxygen as possible and to remove as much carbon dioxide as possible with each breath, or with each gill kind of flap. Okay. The structure. So the key organs located inside of your rib cage, you've got two lobes. The right lobe is often larger than the left. And if you think about why that is and where the left is located and what else happens to also be on the left side of the lung, hopefully you'll be able to realize that the heart is also sitting right on the left side of the lung, and so therefore the left lung is a little bit smaller than the right. Okay. Now, the process, air enters into the pharynx. Now the pharynx is at the top, yeah, and then it goes down the windpipe, which is called the trachea, and then it goes straight down into the bronchi. Now, the trachea or the windpipe is filled with cartilage. Now, the cartilage serves a really important function because your body needs oxygen. It needs oxygen at all times, and cartilage provides that support network to keep the air pipes open at all times, but remaining flexible. So it needs to be flexible, that if you move back and forth and twist and do heavy exercise, it still can keep up with that, but it needs to be strong enough and kept open at all times so that you can get oxygen into your cells. Okay. From there, it splits into the bronchi, which breaks it off into each of the lobes, and then the bronchi become bronchioles, which are smaller tubes, and then eventually at the end of the small tubes, you have the alveoli. Yeah, the alveoli or the air sacs allow the gas exchange to occur. Okay. Human lungs have about 300 million alveoli, and the passageways generally get smaller and smaller as you move through, and the alveoli are surrounded by a rich supply of blood vessels and capillaries. Okay, so if we zoom in and have a look carefully at the process of gas exchange, you can see there the walls of the alveoli sacs and the blood capillaries are very thin. Right there you can see just a very small thin layer along there. On one side you've got the capillary network where the blood is, and then on the other side here you have the external environment inside the air sacs. Yeah, oxygen goes in, and you can see it happen through diffusion because by now the blood is oxygen poor because it's come from the heart and it's gone to the lungs to collect the oxygen, and it's oxygen poor, and it is also rich in carbon dioxide, which then diffuses in the opposite direction. Okay. So O2 in air is higher than the O2 in blood, and so it diffuses into the blood, binding with the hemoglobin, and when it binds with the hemoglobin, it binds to the iron component inside the hemoglobin, which then transports around the body Okay, the opposite happens with CO2. It's higher in the blood than in air, and so it diffuses into the lungs. Okay, and then both move down a concentration gradient, and therefore it is a passive diffusion, and it's a passive transport process. Okay, because it's passive and it's a diffusion, it's a bit of a slow process, and so the main advantage of the lungs is that it needs to have a high surface area to volume ratio so that you can get enough oxygen for the cell's regular needs. Okay. If you stretch out your lungs, they will typically take up an entire tennis court. That is, if we were to take each of your air sacs and open them up and lay them flat, they would take up the size of a tennis court, which is pretty phenomenal if you think about it in terms of surface area. And so if you run the amount of air across a tennis court, that's how much air you are getting into your lungs with each breath. Okay, a network of capillaries sits right on the outside surrounding it, making it easy for it to diffuse into the blood. And then likewise with the veins as well, okay, coming in to collect it and bring it back. The arteries the veins bring it back to the heart where it gets then pumped around the body, okay. Oops, I think I went too far. Okay, that's it for that video, so I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys next time.